The Book of the Prophet Zechariah. The first major section of the Book of Zechariah deals with the restoration of God's people to the land. The rest of the book is made up of an extended section that uses apocalyptic imagery to describe the future Messianic Age. Like Haggai, Zechariah lived during the time of Zerubbabel's governorship over Judah, the high priesthood of Joshua, and the reign of Darius the Great over Persia. And like Haggai, Zechariah called on the people to rebuild the temple. The book opens by saying that the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah during the second year of the reign of King Darius the Great. Therefore, tell the people, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Return to me, declares the Lord Almighty, and I will return to you, says the Lord Almighty. Do not be like your ancestors, to whom the earlier prophets proclaimed, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Turn from your evil ways and your evil practices. But they would not listen or pay attention to me, declares the Lord. Then they repented and said, the Lord Almighty has done to us what our ways and practices deserve, just as he determined to do. After this, 8 visions are recorded. In the first vision, Zechariah sees an angel standing among the myrtle trees, and he sees that there's a host of horsemen patrolling the earth, who report that all is quiet. The angel asks God how much longer he's going to withhold mercy from Jerusalem and Judah, and God promises to restore his people and judge their oppressors. In the second vision, Zechariah sees 4 horns and 4 craftsmen. The 4 horns represent the nations that had scattered God's people and destroyed their dignity, and the 4 craftsmen represented God's forces against those nations. He would scatter them as they had scattered his people. In the third vision, Zechariah sees a man measuring Jerusalem, and he learns that God is marking off Jerusalem as his own. He will dwell there and provide protection, and he warns Judah's enemies of future slavery and offers to join the repentant nation to himself. In the fourth vision, Zechariah sees the high priest Joshua, but Joshua is in filthy garments. The Satan stands ready to point out the sin of Joshua and his predecessors, but God rebukes the Satan, and Joshua is given clean new clothes, and he is referred to as God's servant, the branch. Joshua marks the beginning of a new work. The branch will bring in a new age, and God says, I will remove the sin of this land in a single day. In the fifth vision, Zechariah sees a gold lampstand and 2 olive trees. The angel explains to him that the gold lampstand represents the Spirit of the Lord, whose 7 eyes go throughout all the earth, and whose word approves of the work of Zerubbabel in rebuilding the temple. The 2 olive trees represent the 2 who are anointed to serve the Lord of all the earth. In the sixth vision, Zechariah sees a flying scroll. It's very large and has writing on both sides, and it represents the curse and God's convicting word. In the seventh vision, Zechariah sees a woman representing wickedness. An angel shoves the woman in a large basket and seals the lid with lead. Zechariah then sees a woman with wings carry the basket away to Babylon. The message of the vision is that God will remove his people's sin. In the eighth vision, Zechariah sees 4 chariots emerging from between 2 bronze mountains. The chariots represent spirits of heaven who patrol the earth at God's command, and we see that God is sovereign over all the nations. The spirits report that God's spirit now has rest in the north. God had dealt with his enemies and can now continue to restore his people. Later, God told Zechariah to make a crown and to place it on the head of Joshua the high priest. God explained that his servant, the branch, would build the temple, rule as a priest on his throne, and bring peace between the offices of king and priest. Some scholars suggest the text may have originally hinted at Zerubbabel and Joshua's unity of purpose, political and spiritual leadership working together in harmony. Ultimately, though, the text points to Jesus, in whom the offices of king and priest find perfect unity. Jesus built God's temple, the church. Jesus intercedes for believers as our great high priest, and Jesus is also the successor to David's throne and will rule forever as King of Kings. We then hear about the joy of the Messianic Age. A delegation from Bethel shows up and asks, should we keep fasting on special days to remember Jerusalem's destruction? And God's answer to them is, remember the past to avoid following the ways of your ancestors who were exiled. Fasting lets you humble yourself before God and seek righteousness, but fasting to feel sorry for yourself is a waste of time. The Lord then promises to bless Jerusalem. God will gather his people and reestablish his name in Jerusalem. He will restore his relationship with his children and bring lasting peace and blessing. Through this, Israel can become a light to other nations, and other peoples will see God's blessing and seek it for themselves. We then hear about the triumph of the Messianic Age. First, we hear about judgment on Israel's enemies. God will remove Israel's neighboring enemies and form a remnant from among them. Zechariah then speaks of the coming of Zion's king. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will take away the chariots from Ephraim, and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. Then the Lord will appear over them. His arrow will flash like lightning. The sovereign Lord will sound the trumpet. He will march in the storms of the south, and the Lord Almighty will shield them. Part of God's restoration of his people included removing their bad leaders. Zechariah described the leaders as 3 worthless shepherds who cared little for their sheep. At God's command, Zechariah assumed leadership, but the people rejected his good leadership. The prophet warned the people another evil leader would come before God's ultimate leader would appear. Scholars have tried to identify the 3 shepherds Zechariah mentioned, as well as the future evil shepherd. Some suggest the shepherds were priests of Zechariah's day. Some say they were political leaders. Some say they represent prophets, priests, and rulers. Zechariah writes, "Then I took my staff called Favor and broke it, revoking the covenant I had made with all the nations. It was revoked on that day, and so the oppressed of the flock who were watching me knew it was the word of the Lord. I told them, if you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So they paid me 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they valued me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them to the potter at the house of the Lord. Then I broke my second staff, called Union, breaking the family bond between Judah and Israel." Zechariah says that God will bring victory in his coming kingdom. Jerusalem will be God's instrument, but the triumph will be his, and he will destroy all the nations that gather against his people. And he says that the nation will then embrace their God, and that as God pours out his Spirit, his people will look upon one whom they have pierced, and mourn for him as one would mourn for the death of an only son. In the New Testament, John the Apostle connected this prophecy with the crucifixion of Jesus. Zechariah says, "On that day a fountain will be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and impurity, but God's shepherd will be struck down. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered," he says. Through this process, God would prepare a special remnant for his purposes. In the New Testament, during his last meal with his disciples, Jesus warned them about his coming arrest, and he told them that they would fulfill this prophetic word. And they did. They all scattered like sheep. At the end of the book, Zechariah foretells a day when all nations will gather themselves against Jerusalem. But at the last minute, God will intervene, deliver his people, and establish his everlasting kingdom. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights on a day of battle. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley, with half of the mountain moving north and half moving south. On that day, there will be neither sunlight nor cold, frosty darkness. It will be a unique day, a day known only to the Lord, with no distinction between day and night. When evening comes, there will be light. On that day, living water will flow out from Jerusalem, half of it east to the Dead Sea, and half of it west to the Mediterranean Sea, in summer and in winter. This is the plague with which the Lord will strike all the nations that fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are still standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. On that day, people will be stricken by the Lord with great panic. They will seize each other by the hand and attack one another. Then the survivors from all the nations that have attacked Jerusalem will go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord Almighty, and to celebrate the Festival of Tabernacles. If any of the peoples of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord Almighty, they will have no rain. On that day, holy to the Lord will be inscribed on the bells of the horses, and the cooking pots in the Lord's house will be like the sacred bowls in front of the altar. In the New Testament, if we are to believe Luke's timeline of events, Jesus would have been born during the Festival of Tabernacles. When Zechariah wrote about the Messiah's coming, he did not distinguish sharply between his first and second comings. For him, as with many other prophets, the Messiah's coming kingdom was just one glorious future. And that's the book of Zechariah in a nutshell.